The year is 1971. It is a Friday night in August, and the most powerful economy on Earth is about to be quietly murdered in a room that history almost forgot. Outside, the mountain air was cool and indifferent. Inside Laurel Lodge, beneath fluorescent lights and behind closed mahogany doors, these 15 men were preparing to perform the single most consequential act of financial surgery in the history of modern civilization. They were going to sever the last living artery between the American dollar and gold. They were going to transform the monetary backbone of the entire planet into something that had never existed before at this scale. Pure paper, pure promise, pure air. And they did it in a weekend. Think about that. Thousands of years of monetary history, 5,000 years of gold functioning as the anchor of human exchange, the store of value that kept governments honest and populations protected. Gone. Not through a war, not through a catastrophe, through a quiet Friday night meeting in the mountains, attended by 15 men whom most Americans alive today cannot name. The world woke up Monday morning, and nothing looked different. The sun rose, the newspapers printed, the markets opened, but the ground beneath every wallet, every savings account, every pension, every paper note in every pocket on Earth had just shifted permanently and without warning. The anchor had been cut. The ship was now adrift, and most passengers would not realize it for years. Some still haven't. This is the story of that weekend. This is the forensic account of the hour-by-hour dismantling of the Bretton Woods system, the secret arguments behind those closed doors, the men who engineered it, the families who had already moved their wealth to safety before the announcement, and the mathematical trap that was quietly locked around every working person on Earth the moment Nixon stepped in front of the cameras on Sunday night and smiled. Let us go back. Let us go inside the room. The crisis had been building for years before that August weekend, but it had reached a point of absolute rupture by the summer of 1971. Here is the cold arithmetic that was sitting on John Connally's desk when he walked into Camp David. The United States government had promised the world through the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 that every 35 American dollars could be exchanged for 1 troy ounce of gold held in American vaults. This was the deal. The dollar was not just a currency, it was a receipt, a claim check, a legal document that said, beneath all the ink and the eagle and the presidential seal, you are holding stored gold. The dollar had meaning because it had metal behind it. Every nation on Earth had signed onto this arrangement. Their own currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. This was the spine of the entire post-war financial architecture. Remove it, and everything collapses into free float. But here is what the American government had been doing quietly since the mid-1950s. It had been printing dollars far faster than it was accumulating gold. The Vietnam War was hemorrhaging money. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were hemorrhaging money. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower had warned about on his way out the door was consuming billions every year. To pay for it, Washington printed dollars. Not real dollars backed by gold, excess dollars. Dollars that existed as paper but had no corresponding gold in Fort Knox or anywhere else. By 1971, the U.S. had $35 billion in gold reserves, but had issued well over $60 billion in dollar obligations to foreign governments alone. The ratio had inverted catastrophically. The receipt said one thing, the vault held another. France understood this before anyone else moved. Charles de Gaulle had begun quietly demanding gold for French dollar holdings as early as 1965. He sent the French Navy to collect physical bullion from American shores. He called the dollar's special status an exorbitant privilege, and he was right. Other nations watched France and began doing the same. West Germany converted dollars to gold. Switzerland converted. Britain, in the summer of 1971, walked into the Treasury and asked to convert $750 million into gold immediately. That request, according to documents declassified decades later, was the final trigger. The vault was almost empty. The run had begun. And that is why 15 men drove quietly into the Maryland mountains on a Friday night to discuss the unthinkable. Now let us go inside the room. Let us go minute by minute through what happened at Laurel Lodge, because the details matter. The details reveal who these men were, what they truly believed, and what they were really protecting. Nixon opened the session by handing the floor to Paul Volcker. Volcker, who would later become Federal Reserve Chairman and one of the most consequential monetary figures of the 20th century, was at this point the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Monetary Affairs. He was 33 years old, brilliant, deeply knowledgeable, and visibly uncomfortable. He had prepared a document that laid out 3 options. 1. Defend the dollar's gold convertibility by drastically cutting government spending, raising interest rates to punishing levels, and accepting a severe recession. 2. Devalue the dollar against gold, but maintain convertibility at a new lower ratio. 3. Close the gold window entirely, end convertibility, let the dollar float. Transform it from a gold receipt into a pure fiat instrument backed by nothing except the declared faith of the United States government. Option 1 was politically impossible. It would have meant telling Americans the party was over, that the government had overspent catastrophically, and that the bill was now due in the form of austerity and unemployment. Option 2 was humiliating, and many in the room argued only a temporary delay before the same crisis returned. Option 3 was radical. It was, as one participant later recalled, the nuclear option. But it was the only option that solved the immediate crisis without requiring sacrifice from those who had created it. John Connally pushed hard for option 3. Connally was not an economist. He was a Texas politician, a former governor, a man who operated in pure power calculus. He had no ideological attachment to gold. He had no sentimental connection to Bretton Woods. He saw the situation as he saw all situations, as a contest of force, and he was determined that America would not lose it. His famous line from that weekend, preserved in multiple participant accounts, was something to the effect of, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." The foreign nations demanding gold in exchange for their surplus dollars were, in Connally's framing, adversaries to be outmaneuvered, not partners to be honored. Arthur Burns, the Federal Reserve Chairman, was deeply reluctant. Burns understood what closing the gold window truly meant. He understood that an unbacked fiat currency operated by a government with demonstrated willingness to spend beyond its means was a machine for inflation. He argued, he pushed back, he raised concerns about the international repercussions, about the signal this sent to markets, about the long-term credibility of American monetary policy. His concerns were noted, recorded, and ultimately overridden. George Shultz, then director of the Office of Management and Budget, was supportive of the move. He was a Chicago school economist who believed in market mechanisms and floating exchange rates. For Shultz, this was not a crisis, but an opportunity, a chance to let markets determine currency values rather than fixing them artificially through government decree. Herbert Stein, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers, worked the numbers. William Safire, Nixon's speechwriter, was brought in Saturday to begin drafting the presidential address that would deliver the news to the American public. Safire later wrote extensively about the weekend in his memoir and described the atmosphere as a combination of excitement and dread. Brilliant men doing something they knew was momentous and were not entirely certain was wise. by Saturday afternoon, the decision was effectively made. The gold window would close, convertibility would end, the dollar would float. Nixon would announce it Sunday night in a primetime television address framed not as a retreat, but as a bold new economic policy, not as the end of a promise, but as the dawn of a new era. They also decided on two additional measures that have received far less historical attention than they deserve. A 90-day freeze on wages and prices across the entire American economy. An act of government control over private commerce so sweeping that it would have been considered unthinkable under normal circumstances. And a 10% surcharge on all imports, a protectionist tariff designed to pressure trading partners into accepting new currency arrangements favorable to the United States. These three actions taken together represent what economists later called the Nixon shock. But shock implies surprise. For 15 men in that room on that mountain, there was no shock at all. There was only execution. Here is where it gets truly dark. Here is where the investigation turns from history into architecture. Because what those 15 men built in that room was not merely a solution to a short-term liquidity crisis. What they constructed, whether by design or by consequence, was a new type of global monetary cage, and every human being on Earth was locked inside it before they even knew the door had closed. Before August 15th, 1971, money had a physical referent. A dollar represented something tangible, something finite, something that existed in a vault somewhere and could not simply be summoned into existence by a government decision. This physical constraint was the only meaningful check on government monetary expansion. Governments could not print gold. They could only print paper up to the point where the paper corresponded to actual gold reserves. The gold standard was not perfect. Economists debated its limitations vigorously, but it performed one function with absolute mechanical reliability. It prevented governments from spending money that did not exist in perpetuity, because eventually someone would come to the vault and demand the gold, and if the gold was not there, the fraud would be exposed. After August 15th, 1971, that constraint ceased to exist. Money became, from that moment forward, a liability, not an asset, a liability of the central bank that issued it. When you hold a dollar today, you are not holding a claim on anything physical. You are holding a debt instrument, a promise from the Federal Reserve to honor its own obligations, backed by the full faith and credit of a government that has, as of 2024, accumulated over $33 trillion in sovereign debt. The paper in your wallet is, in the most precise mathematical sense, a piece of someone else's debt that you are holding as if it were wealth. This transformation had consequences that compounded every single year from 1971 onward. In the decade before Nixon's announcement, consumer prices in America rose at an average annual rate of roughly 2 to 3%. In the decade after, that rate climbed to between 6 and 9%, peaking at 13% in 1979. The purchasing power of a $1,971, measured against goods and services, has declined by over 85% by the early 2022. That means if you had kept $1,000 in cash savings from the day Nixon spoke to the nation, that money would buy less than $150 worth of goods today. Not because of natural economic forces, because the instrument itself was redesigned deliberately to lose value over time. This is not a side effect. This is the mechanism. When money is debt, and the issuer of that debt is also the issuer of the currency, inflation is not an accident. Inflation is how the debt is managed. It is how governments repay in depreciated dollars the obligations they accumulated in stronger ones. It is, in the bluntest possible terms, legalized theft from every person who saves in the currency of the indebted government. And every currency on earth, because every currency on earth was pegged to the dollar under Bretton Woods, was swept into this new system simultaneously the moment Nixon closed the gold window. Think about what that means globally. Think about how many families in 1971 in Germany, in Japan, in Britain, in India, in every corner of the world were holding savings in their national currencies. Those savings were no longer anchored to gold, even indirectly through the dollar peg. Those families had been enrolled in a global fiat experiment without their knowledge or consent. The contract had been changed while they slept. Now, let us talk about the masterminds. Let us talk about the families and institutions who did not sleep, who had been watching the vault for years, who understood what the reversal of Bretton Woods would mean before the cameras rolled on Sunday night. The Rockefeller banking interests, centered at Chase Manhattan, had been positioning for a floating currency environment for years. David Rockefeller had met with Nixon's team multiple times in the period leading up to the shock. Chase and its affiliated financial institutions were deeply invested in the emerging euro-dollar market, a market for dollar-denominated deposits held outside the United States and therefore outside Federal Reserve regulation. A market that would explode in size and profitability in a floating rate environment because it thrived on currency volatility and capital mobility. When the dollar was freed from gold, the eurodollar market became the single largest unregulated money pool in human history. The institutions already positioned within it made fortunes that are difficult to comprehend. The major oil-producing nations and the financial cartels allied to them had a very specific preparation underway. Within 2 years of the Nixon shock, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries would impose the oil embargo of 1973. The timing is not coincidental if you trace the archival correspondence. When the dollar lost its gold backing, the United States needed a new anchor for dollar demand globally. It needed a reason for every nation on earth to continue holding and trading in dollars, despite the fact that those dollars were now just paper. The solution that emerged, documented in declassified State Department cables, was the petrodollar arrangement. Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations agreed to price all global oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the United States provided military protection and security guarantees to the Gulf monarchies. The result was that every nation on earth that needed oil, which meant every nation on earth, had to hold U.S. dollars to buy it. The dollar's global reserve status was preserved not through gold, but through black gold. The system was rebuilt on petroleum instead of metal, and the transition had been engineered with extraordinary precision by people who had known for years that the gold window would eventually close. For ordinary working families, the period between 1971 and 1981 was not a transition. It was a decimation. Savings vanished in real terms. Pension funds that had been carefully accumulated in dollars saw their purchasing power collapse. Small farmers and working-class homeowners who had borrowed at fixed rates saw their debts eroded by inflation, which was one of the few beneficiaries of the new system, but the same inflation destroyed the value of their savings, their wages in real terms, and the predictability of every financial plan they had made for their future. Here is the question that haunts this entire investigation. If closing the gold window was genuinely a temporary emergency measure, as Nixon explicitly stated on television that Sunday night, why was it never reversed? Why, 53 years later, does no gold window exist? Why has every administration since Nixon, from both political parties, maintained a pure fiat system with zero physical constraint on monetary expansion? What does it tell you that a temporary crisis measure became the permanent architecture of global finance, and that the people who benefited most from that architecture were the same people in the room on that Friday night in August 1971? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Were the men in that room responding to a crisis, or were they creating the conditions for a new kind of permanent financial dominance? The evidence is there if you look at who prospered in the decades that followed. Now let us talk about what survived. Let us talk about what the masterminds themselves held when they were not holding paper. This is the escape route. This is the part of the historical record that is most carefully buried because it is the most instructive. The institutions and families who engineered or anticipated the Nixon shock did not hold their long-term wealth in dollars. They never had. The Rockefeller fortune was held in physical assets, real estate, oil rights, land, equity positions in hard asset corporations, and gold bullion held through international custodians outside the reach of any single government. The old European banking families, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the merchant banking dynasties of Zurich and Amsterdam had maintained gold positions in Swiss vaults continuously since the 19th century. They did not liquidate those positions when the dollar was floated. They accumulated. In the immediate aftermath of the Nixon shock between 1971 and 1973, gold prices in the free market exploded from the official $35 per troy ounce to over $200. By 1980, gold had reached $850 per ounce in nominal terms. The individuals and institutions holding gold when the window closed in August 1971 saw their holdings multiply 25-fold in less than a decade. The families who were inside the room, or who had relationships with the people inside the room, and who had been quietly accumulating gold positions in the years preceding the shock, experienced one of the greatest wealth transfers in modern history, from the paper-holding public to the hard asset-holding elite. This is not conspiracy. This is documented price history. This is archival record. Gold was $35 per ounce in August 1971. Anyone holding significant gold reserves at that moment became extraordinarily wealthy over the following decade as fiat currencies around the world inflated simultaneously and gold repriced to reflect the true diminished value of the paper it was no longer backing. The historical lesson from 1971 is not subtle. It is not complicated. It does not require a finance degree to understand. Every time in recorded history that a government has severed the connection between its currency and a physical anchor, the currency has eventually inflated, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically, but always in the direction of reduced purchasing power for those who hold it. The Roman Empire debased its silver denarius over centuries. Weimar Germany destroyed the mark in a matter of months in 1923, Zimbabwe in the 2000 seconds, Venezuela in the 2010 seconds. These are not different stories. They are the same story told across different geographies and timescales, and the story always ends the same way. Those holding paper are wiped out. Those holding real assets, land, productive enterprises, precious metals, resources with intrinsic utility, survive and often emerge in a position of relative strength. The men in that Camp David room understood this. They understood it so thoroughly that they had already made their preparations before the announcement. John Connally had significant real estate holdings. Arthur Burns understood gold's historical function better than almost any living economist. Paul Volcker spent the rest of his career trying to rebuild monetary credibility through interest rate discipline precisely because he understood how badly the 1971 decision had damaged the foundations of sound money. But understanding the damage you have done does not undo it. We are now 53 years removed from that August weekend. The global debt load built on the architecture created in that lodge in the Catoctin Mountains has grown to levels that are, by any historical measure, without precedent. Total global debt across sovereign, corporate, and household categories now exceeds $307 trillion. The United States alone carries over $33 trillion in federal debt, with unfunded obligations in entitlement programs that some analyses place as high as $200 trillion when measured over a generation. These numbers are not sustainable under any conventional economic model. They are only serviceable as long as the dollar retains its reserve currency status. As long as the world continues accepting paper in exchange for real goods, as long as the petrodollar arrangement holds its diplomatic architecture. The same structural signals that preceded the August 1971 meeting are visible again if you know what you are looking at. Foreign central banks reducing their dollar reserve holdings. Gold purchases by sovereign nations at record levels, with China, Russia, Poland, India, and Turkey all accelerating physical gold accumulation over the past decade. The BRICS coalition developing alternative settlement mechanisms that do not require dollar intermediation. The International Monetary Fund issuing quiet warnings about dollar concentration risk in global reserves. These are not academic footnotes. These are the same early tremors that preceded the French Navy arriving at American shores in 1965 to collect its gold. History does not announce its repetitions. It does not send formal notice. It simply arranges the same conditions and waits for the same pressures to produce the same results. The men who understood what those conditions meant in 1971 were ready. The men who dismissed the signals as temporary aberrations were not. Share this video with one person you care about, because this warning is too critical to keep hidden. The Camp David story is not ancient history. It is the operating manual of the financial system you are living inside right now, and the cracks that were engineered into that system on a Friday night in August 1971 have been widening every year since. The escape route that existed for the masterminds of 1971 still exists in modified form today. Physical assets, equity in productive enterprises, exposure to commodities and resources with intrinsic utility independent of any government's monetary decisions. Gold and silver in physical form outside the banking system. Land with productive capacity. The historical record across every fiat collapse in documented history shows that these assets preserve value through monetary transitions in ways that paper instruments do not. This is not investment advice. This is archaeology. This is what the evidence shows when you examine what survived and what was wiped out in every previous iteration of this story. The 15 men who drove into the Catoctin Mountains on August 13, 1971, knew they were changing the world. They knew the announcement Nixon would make on Sunday night would permanently alter the relationship between governments and citizens, between paper promises and real value, between the state's power to create money and the individual's ability to preserve wealth. They made their preparations accordingly. The question that only you can answer is whether you will do the same. Subscribe to the channel archive. Every investigation we publish goes deeper into the hidden mechanisms of financial history that shaped the world you live in and will determine the world your children inherit. The evidence is there. The record exists. The story has been buried, but it has not been destroyed. We will keep uncovering it. The gold window closed on a Sunday night in August 1971. It has never reopened, and the world has been living with the consequences every single day since.